This will be a good spot to test out the A7C and the A7 III for some very moody winter photos.
Hey, if you don't know me, my name's Jake, and I create content here to help solo creators on the go. People like me who are working by themselves on the go, creating small commercial projects or stuff for here on YouTube. So I test and review equipment here in Alaska, and I do tips and tutorials on how to use that equipment so that you can tell better stories and make smart decisions when you go to buy a new piece of gear. Today we're comparing the A7 III and the A7C. Two fantastic cameras, but one of them is likely to be the best for you. But it's a snowy, moody winter day, and I want to go out and shoot and test both of these cameras on location out in Alaska, see how they do in a very, very wintry day.
This is going to be a great spot. Idea was to actually build a fire like out there and do some photos with the fire here, especially since the tide is nice and high and the water is so calm. This should be a really sweet spot to test these two cameras out. So as it turns out, the tide is coming in really rapidly because the whole little snowy area I was sitting a minute ago is gone. And apparently it's supposed to come in for another 3 hours, so we may not be starting the fire down here after all. But we're gonna snap some pictures with the A7 III and then with the A7C and try and get roughly the same composition, see how they compare. While these cameras are technically the same specs as far as electronics and sensors and stuff like that goes, there is quite a bit of difference in the fact that the A7 III has a lot more customizable buttons. It has a front and a rear dial, plus the little 5D joystick, whereas the A7C only has a rear dial and no 5D joystick and almost no customizable buttons. I mean, you can customize these back here, but if you're doing a lot of photography work, I would lean toward the A7 III because it gives you access to a lot more of the controls a lot quicker, whereas the A7C is actually a little bit better for video work, especially if you film yourself because of the vari-angle screen. You can film yourself. Plus, in the video side, it has the newer color science, which more closely matches something like the A7S III, which is what I'm filming this on now, which is spectacular. But you are limited to 8-bit color in this, just like you are with the A7 III. Both of these have the same sensor, they both have the same video specs. You can shoot 4K up to 30 frames a second, you can shoot 1080p in S&Q mode up to 120 frames a second, but it is that 8-bit video codec, which is, you're pretty limited to how much you can do in post, color grading and stuff like that. That being said, the colors out of camera on this are really nice and pleasing. They're good. I've used this for a lot of years and nobody's ever complained about the colors out of it. Another thing to consider between these two cameras is the autofocus system. The A7C has the newer autofocus system, which has the constant eye tracking, and there's no 30-minute record limit, which makes it much better for video work because you're not going to be having to stop and restart the camera if you do long form content. If you do short form content, it's not going to be a big deal, but the upgraded autofocus system is significantly better for video work because it's always catching your eye and being locked onto you that way. Since the tide is coming in rapidly, and since I was just a few minutes ago standing out by that stick out there, we need to move to higher ground because we won't be able to stay here for much longer without getting wet. Location 2. Nice little river thing that flows through here. We're going right down there. We're gonna set up the fire and then shoot going up the river. I don't know if this is gonna work, but it's an idea I've always wanted to try, and since I'm testing two great photo cameras, why not try it with them? A7C is a little bit smaller, but not significantly smaller. I mean, it's not huge. I do find the A7 III is actually more comfortable to hold because it has a little bit bigger grip over here, which makes it nicer. So a few other things you need to consider if you're trying to decide between these two cameras. This one only has one card slot, so you're putting both your photos and your videos on one card and there's no redundancy. Whereas this one, you can decide to either have redundant files, which is nice if you're shooting for clients and you don't want to take the chance of losing your footage, or you can split up so your photos go to one card and your videos go to the other card, which is what I do most of the time, because then it's pretty easy to get the footage and the photos off and put them in their respective programs. Another thing that I found really did bother me about the A7C is this EVF is terrible. It's just the worst. I don't know why they even put it on there. But the fact that you can't put a nicer cup on it to put your eye up to makes it really difficult to use. And it's smaller. The EVF is smaller than the EVF on the A7 III. See if I can get that up closer. Like, there's the size of the A7 III EVF. It's sucky. And the resolution is really terrible too. The in-body image stabilization works about the same on both cameras. I'd say it's slightly worse on the A7C, just by a bit. But if you put a lens on it with optical image stabilization or some sort of lens-based stabilization, then it's actually really nice and works really well. But the same would be true with the A7 III if you did that. In areas where the A7C wins out over the A7 III is things like this. For video shooters, it's much better because it has the flip out screen and you don't need to adjust as many settings, because generally you set your aperture, you set your shutter speed and kind of let it go from there. Still would be nice to have some more controls, but it also has 3 programmable, user programmable presets, so you can switch quickly between your different video modes if you want to, which makes it pretty nice and lessens the need for custom buttons. The other area this wins out on video over the A7 III, or in general, is it has the much better autofocus system, the newer autofocus system, and the better colors that they've come out with, like on the A7S III and stuff like that. Another area where the A7C wins for video is the mic ports, and the USB ports are a lot nicer on this. They don't dangle or flap around in the breeze like the A7 III does. These are solid, they're really nicely put in there. In areas where this is not as nice as the A7 III, or the A7 III wins out over the A7C, definitely if you need redundancy for both cards or you want to split between 2 cards, that is a big area where the A7 III wins out. In general, I would say if you're doing mostly video shooting and you don't need redundancy on the SD cards, then the A7C probably does win out over the A7 III for video. The A7 III handily, hands down, wins over the A7C for photography. I mean, they're the same sensor, but it just has so much more customizable buttons to be able to grab controls or change things quickly, because it has both a front and a back dial and the 5D joystick here. You can touch and grab things, change things quickly, aperture, shutter speed, anything like that. For video, it's pretty close. But the A7C definitely wins out over that. The difference is that the A7 III has slightly better in-body image stabilization. It definitely has a better EVF than the A7 III does, or the A7C does. But the downside is if you're shooting a lot of video of yourself, you have to use something like this, a little mirror attachment, in order to be able to see what you're shooting and what you're framing. It is pretty important because it's hard to totally 100% trust the exposure on these, even though they do a really good job. Battery life between both of these things are pretty much exactly the same. Either one of these cameras will do great for you, but if you're going to be a heavy video shooter, and that's going to be most of what you do, I'd kind of lean toward the A7C because it has the better autofocus system and the flip out screen. But if you're doing both, or if you're doing more photo work than video work, the A7 III is still hands down, I think, the best camera you can buy for under $2,000. If you want to see ways to use your camera or the ways to set it up, if you own an A7 III or an A7C, click or tap right there. I've put together a playlist that will take you through some of the ways I've set my cameras up and the ways I use them to get the most use out of one of these cameras. Click or tap there. I'll see you in one of those videos. As always, if you've got questions, ask me in the comments below or join my live stream Wednesday nights at 4 p.m. Alaska time, 8 p.m. Eastern. I'll see you again soon in the next video. Cheers.